Buonasera, bentornati con questo nostro appuntamento di Liberi Oltre Confine. Questa volta siamo oltre confine, ma in realtà parliamo di una vicenda che ci ha riguardato da vicino nel nostro paese. In Italia ricorderete che qualche tempo fa c'è stata una nomina da parte del governo di 5 economisti per il nucleo tecnico per il coordinamento della politica economica, che doveva avere anche qualche responsabilità di valutazione e di stima degli effetti non politiche inerenti il PNRR, e tra queste nomine vi erano due economisti ben noti a chi ci segue, cioè Riccardo Puglisi e Carlo Stagnaro. La nomina di Puglisi e Stagnaro ha suscitato un'alzata di scudi da parte di altri economisti che si sono dati da fare, hanno fatto diverse iniziative, tra cui una lettera firmata da una sessantina di loro, poi il numero è cresciuto, che andava in qualche modo a sottolineare il fatto che era inappropriato procedere alla nomina di due economisti come Puglisi e Stagnaro, non tanto per una questione di competenze di cui essi erano sprovvisti, ma in ragione della loro appartenenza ideologica, del fatto che si trattava di due economisti liberisti. Ora, questo genere di appello in Italia ha una sua storia che è stata ben ricordata anche da Antonio Polito sul Corriere della Sera, ci riporta pagine non belle della storia italiana in un paese come il nostro, nel quale come dire, la polarizzazione ideologica è stata materia con la quale gli intellettuali molto spesso hanno giocato e purtroppo, come sappiamo, in Italia abbiamo anche una storia di violenza politica che diciamo così, dovrebbe indurre a qualche cautela in più. Però cerchiamo invece di ampliare lo sguardo, di guardare ad altri casi simili o diversi nei quali alcuni economisti hanno deciso di fare sentire la propria voce scrivendo una lettera e mettendosi assieme per invitare il governo a prendere decisioni politiche di un segno o di un altro. Ne parliamo oggi con un caro amico, cioè con il professor Philip Booth, che è Professor of Economics alla University of Buckingham ed è anche direttore del Vinson Centre, che è un interessante think tank universitario che ha sede presso quella università. E con lui vogliamo parlare, tanto per cominciare, di una lettera più famosa, insomma, di quella che ha tentato di far deragliare la nomina di Stagnaro e Puglisi, cioè la lettera che 364 economisti di ispirazione keynesiana scrissero e pubblicarono, se non ricordo male, nel 1981, per criticare le politiche del governo di Margaret Thatcher. Parliamo ovviamente in inglese. Hello, Philip. Thank you very much for being with us today. Sorry for this introduction in Italian.
Hello, and thank you.
Well, I was mentioning, and I mentioned it to you, that, a few weeks ago we had some problems in Italy with two economists. One is Carlo Stagnaro, that you know, the other one is Riccardo Puglisi, who were appointed to basically a council of economists and other professionals who are supposed to be providing assistance and advice of sorts to the head of the Prime Minister Office Department on Economic Policy. So, something which is quite remote from the moment in which economic policy decisions are actually taken. But, they're part of this body which is meant to support, to revise, to evaluate some of the economic policies of the government, and in particular, in this historical moment, policies that are related with this grand flow of public investment, which is supposed to be happening with the so-called recovery fund, this money that the European Union is giving us to support Italy transitioning to a greener economy, a more digital economy, and so on and so forth in the wake of the pandemic. So there was a letter by some left of center economists And they had a series of contentions, first of all, but the most important one was, you cannot put economists that do not like public spending, that are not ideologically biased in favor of public spending, in charge of evaluating public spending, which is a bit bizarre. But you studied similar events in the past, and I wanted, first of all, to ask you, if this kind of letter does ring a bell, does it calls to your mind, different episodes in history?
Well, there's one particular very famous example in the UK of when 364 economists wrote a letter to the Times during the Thatcher government, just immediately after Geoffrey Howe, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the finance minister, introduced a budget which attempted to reduce government borrowing. And those 364 economists were extremely critical of the budget. Many of those economists, in fact, were really very much at the top of the profession. It included former chief economic advisors to the government, somebody who became governor of the Bank of England. I think a number of people who later joined the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England, and at least one, possibly more, Nobel Prize winners. And this really did represent the weight of opinion within the UK economics profession at the time. There's a famous example of a famous story, which may be apocryphal, but of Margaret Thatcher being asked by Michael Foot, the leader of the opposition in the House of Commons, whether she could name 2 economists who agreed with her to counter the 364. And she did name 2 economists. And the civil servant said to her in the car on the way back to Downing Street, "It's a good job he didn't ask for 3." And that's an indication of how much the weight of the profession at that time in the UK was against this budget, against this policy of the Thatcher government. And what is interesting is that the claims they made in the letter were incredibly strong and were proven almost in real time to be absolutely wrong.
That's a very interesting story. And what were these claims? I mean, why did they react so strongly against the Thatcher government? I mean, if I'm correct, it was 1981, so it was well before privatization and anything, well before the Big Bang. Of course, you've written about that and criticized some aspect of it. So well before, the best known policies of Thatcher in the realm of economic matters.
Well, the complaints were essentially about macroeconomic policy. So the Thatcher government came in on the back of a decade when we'd had very, very high inflation. In the period 1974 to 1979, the price level roughly doubled. And it was decided, really actually following Dennis Healey from the previous Labour government, who was advised by the IMF, because Britain had to take on an IMF loan, to control inflation by controlling the money supply and support that by bringing public expenditure under control. And the claims that the 364 made in their letter was firstly that there is no basis in economic theory or supporting evidence for the government's belief that by deflating demand, they will bring inflation permanently under control and thereby induce an automatic recovery in output and employment. Well, that is just completely wrong. The 364 might believe that the basis in economic theory or supporting evidence is weak or contested or whatever, but there's clearly a basis, and there was at that time clearly a basis in economic theory or supporting evidence. And it's worrying in a sense that such people were teaching undergraduate students apparently oblivious to the fact that there are other ideas out there in the economic in the academic world to which their undergraduates should have been exposed. Secondly, they stated that the present politics will deepen the depression, erode the industrial base of our economy, and threaten its social and political stability. Thirdly, they said there are alternative policies. Well, that's clearly true. And fourthly, that the time has come to reject monetarist policies and consider urgently which alternative offers the best hope of sustained recovery. Well, at least that's a reasonable thing to say. But if we go back to the second point, present policies will deepen the depression, erode the industrial base of our economy, and threaten its social and political stability. Almost at exactly the day they signed the letter was the point of the trough in industrial output, and the recovery took place in fact from March 1981, and then was one of the longest post-war, in fact I think the longest post-war uninterrupted period of economic growth, which started in March 1981, the day that they put the stamp on the letter and sent it to the Times. So that's remarkably bad timing, and I think those involved with the letter probably realised that it was a mistake to speak in such emphatic terms, or to write in such emphatic terms.
Well, did any of those people somehow repent? Did they change their views? I mean, did any of them came back to the subject, 5 or 10 years later, and say, well, perhaps it was too extreme a language to be used in those circumstances?
Yes, well, we had in 2006 we issued a publication at the Institute, from the Institute of Economic Affairs, which was discussing the letter, and it had pieces from a number of economists, including those who had been ringleaders in getting signatories for the letter. We also then had a dinner at the Institute of Economic Affairs. Part of that dinner was recorded and was on the BBC flagship news programme, Newsnight. So there was lots of discussion about those sorts of things at the dinner. I think it's fair to say that there were a variety of opinions. There were some people who believed, who still believed, still in 2006, that what they said was correct, unrepentant, unreconstructed Keynesians, you might say. There were some people who never really agreed with the language in the letter, but it was, they felt they needed to sign a letter protesting about the policies, and that was the only letter in town, so they signed it. And then there are others, without question. I wouldn't like to name them. I've had private conversations with people who will have changed their views since they signed the letter. I mean, it included a number of people who subsequently became members of the Academic Advisory Council of the Institute of Economic Affairs, for example, which was the IEA being one of the main proponents of the ideas of controlling inflation by restraining the money supply, keeping public borrowing under control, and reducing government spending.
Well, that's interesting. So who was the one that really wrote the letter? Because you mentioned the fact somebody was uncomfortable with the language employed. So it means, I mean, of course, yeah, it's impossible that 300 people write a letter. They may sign it, but there is somebody who's writing it.
Yeah. So the ringleaders of the letter were Cambridge economists. There was a school of economists in Cambridge who were staunch Keynesians, and to be honest, you know, the ideas of controlling monetary aggregates would never even come into their models of how they thought about inflation and so on. So the leaders really were a group of economists in Cambridge. In those days, of course, it's extremely difficult to organise such a letter with so many signatories. There are a large number of signatories from Cambridge, and probably from, I'm not quite sure exactly how many, but certainly a few dozen other UK universities, nearly all of the major UK universities. So somebody drafted the letter and sent it to the heads of department of all UK universities, and then got those heads of department were asked to get other people to sign the letter. I'm proud to say that the university I attended, I went to be an undergraduate at Durham University the following year in 1982. I think there was only one signatory on the letter from Durham University, and they'd left by the time I got there. So no, two signatories, and they both left by the time I got there. So I had a rather more open-minded faculty than was common in universities in the UK at that time. And I might add, not just open-minded, but up with what was going on in developments in economics at that time. You know, the theory behind controlling inflation through controlling the money supply, the ideas of expectations being important, the idea that you couldn't trade off inflation and unemployment in the long run. These things were, were being developed in economics in the United States for a good 20 years previously. I think Milton Friedman gave his counter-revolutionary monetary theory lecture in the early 1970s. I can't remember exactly the date. So essentially, the economics departments of UK universities were just not up with the subject.
But the number of people in the UK, I mean, one thing which is always interesting with this kind of letter, and that was certainly the case with Stagnaro, perhaps not the case with the 364 economists, is that, signatories of this letter typically portray themselves as those standing against a consensus, standing against, the powerful neoliberal machinery of sorts. But it seems to me that, if we think about it, even in England, I mean, even just in the very years in which the Thatcher government was taking off, so to say, free market economists were always quite few. And perhaps in England, I suppose, concentrated a fair amount of them at the LSE in those years. I mean, Alan Walters was there, Peter Bauer, Basil Yame, even though, both of them may have been retired by then.
Sure. I mean, it would be absurd to say that there was, and people tried to make this point after the financial crisis, it just isn't true, to argue that there is an unbreakable consensus behind free market economics in the economics profession. Lionel Robbins described economics as being the science of not being able to have your cake and eat it. So economists do understand markets, they do understand trade-offs, they do understand opportunity cost, and they therefore are able to make points such as, if we take the example of the recovery funding and so on in Italy, that if you spend money on one thing, you can't spend it on something else. If you take money out of the pockets of taxpayers to spend on a government program, it's no longer there for taxpayers to spend it on what they would like it to be spent on. Not only that, if you increase taxes, that has an effect on incentives. If you increase borrowing, that has an effect on bond yields and potentially the credit rating of a country and all sorts of other things. Now, economists do understand these types of things, but I would say the prevailing consensus in the Anglo-Saxon world is in favor of what you might call the naive market failure model. That is, there's a broad belief that markets are okay, but they never meet the standards of the idea of perfect competition, which is proposed in textbooks, which of course has very unrealistic assumptions, and therefore the government and government action is rarely questioned. The government should just try to pull lots of levers in order to try to perfect what otherwise would be imperfect markets, and also redistribute income. So that's why you end up with this situation of, in the West, I think, of economists which have a thriving market sector, but that thriving market sector is highly regulated, and then the government spends a lot of a high proportion of national income, especially on welfare and transfers. That's a kind of position, I think, which the consensus of economists now would support. But that's nothing like the kind of free market policies which Friedman or Hayek or Alan Walters would have proposed.
Going back to the letter and going back to 90, 81, 82, what happened after the letter? So, Michael Foot asked Mrs. Thatcher to name 2 economists supporting her policies. I think her economic advisors were a very small number of people. I mean, Alan Walters, Nigel Lawson, I suppose, in those years. Clearly, Geoffrey Howe had been exposed to the Institute of Economic Affairs for ages. I mean, I think he was coming to the IEA when the IEA set up. So what sort of battle of ideas, so to say, followed the publication of the letter?
Well, First of all, just to say the economic environment was extremely difficult. No, I came from a northern town, went to university in a coal mining area, and unemployment did continue to rise for a substantial period of time, even after output recovered. And the reasons for that, I think many people would argue, were because of the very strong trade unions, protections around labour markets, and so on. Every recession we've had since, unemployment has recovered much more quickly. So it was a grim and difficult time for the Thatcher government. Unemployment rose towards 3 million. I don't think it was until 1985 when unemployment actually started falling again. And then she won the 1987 general election triumphantly when the employment situation was looking good, as well as there being very strong economic growth. So Thatcher came in really with an agenda to totally change the nature of the UK economy. Now, she did in some respects, but in other respects not. And she was supported in that agenda by, without question, an academic and an intellectual case, which was made by the Institute of Economic Affairs and others working in think tanks and also academia. And it's true, this is a situation where a government was determined to get reform, a bit like, for example, the Polish government in the late, the first post-communist Polish government. And it, by and large, surrounded itself with advisors who approved of and who could develop policies on the back of a series of principles which were broadly supportive of markets, low inflation, low government borrowing, and so on. So that's quite different from the situation with Staniara, where it looks like the Prime Minister is trying to put together a panel of people who have diverse views so that they can challenge economic policy in that area, they can debate with each other, and the Prime Minister can then make some evaluations based on the debates which happen within that committee that he's appointed. Norman Lamont did that type of thing in the after the UK fell out of the exchange rate mechanism. He appointed a panel of 7 economic advisors, which included people who were very close to the Labour Party. In fact, one of whom I worked with very closely became a Labour peer, and also included people like Tim Congdon and Patrick Minford. So sometimes governments will put together a diverse panels to advise them in order to throw up the maximum number of ideas. The Thatcher government was definitely not like that. It had a clear desire to implement an economic policy which was different from that which had led to the demise of Britain post the Second World War, and a relatively small number of people were driving that policy. And it was against the consensus of the vast majority of the academic economics profession at the time.
Well, absolutely. I mean, the situation is totally different with the Draghi government in Italy, and in many ways, that is best epitomized by the Prime Minister himself. I mean, the Italian Prime Minister is a former central banker who's been at the center of, the economic policy agenda, not only the debate internationally. And looking at his tenure as president of the ECB is very difficult, to picture Draghi as a Friedmanite neoliberal or anything or anything like that. So there was no letter responding to the letter, or was it?
That's a good question. I think it's possible that there was there was a response from the government responding to the letter. There might have been a letter possibly by 1 or 2 economists, possibly by Patrick Minford, responding to the letter. I'm not entirely sure about that, but the government did respond to the letter, saying that it totally disagreed with the assertion that present policies would deepen the depression and weaken the UK's industrial base. It went on to say that countries pursuing policies broadly of the kind being implemented in the UK are those with the strongest industrial base. And no doubt the authors of that response would have had in mind countries such as Germany, Switzerland, and Japan at that time. You wouldn't say there was a debate with hundreds of people, or 364 people lined up on one side and dozens and dozens and dozens of people lined up on the other side. There was a government response and possibly some response by one or two economists in writing themselves to the Times.
Well, you mentioned Germany, and that's, I think, it's a very interesting thing. I mean, we tend to forget that one of the models for the Thatcher government was post-war Germany. So it was ordoliberalism in Germany, which of course it goes against the typical reaction when you talk about these things that associate nowadays, liberalizing policies with Thatcher England and Reagan, so United States. When you look at contemporary economic policies, are we perhaps back in a situation similar to the pre-Thatcher years, in which Germany is clearly with problems and being a high spending social democracy for sure, but is very attached to the idea of fiscal sanity when it comes to public finance, whereas the Anglo-Saxon world is in a public spending euphoria moment.
Yes, I think that's a very fair point, and I think that's especially important if you look at the likely evolution of demographics in Europe, and for that matter in Asia, over the next few decades. So Germany, as with Italy, actually is in an extremely difficult position there. It's going to very soon have probably a falling population, yet a rising elderly population, so which will mean a very large fall in the proportion of people who are of working age. And it knows, because of the welfare systems which exist in Germany, that this will create significant fiscal problems going ahead. And it's reasonable for that reason alone, as well as other reasons, that Germany is pursuing the fiscal policy that it is pursuing. But that gets criticized by Keynesians elsewhere in Europe, including in the United Kingdom, who argue that this somehow deflates demand, damages other countries, and so on, as if somehow, of course, we could all argue about the situations at the extremes of depression and whether you should allow automatic stabilizers to work and these types of things. But there really is no evidence that a sound fiscal policy, including the accumulation of surpluses in normal times, is somehow problematic. As Adam Smith pointed out, that a sound government policy sucks less capital out of the private sector, allows the private sector to be more capital intensive. And again, that's something you probably want with an aging population. So yes, we could look at Germany again, I think, as a model of fiscal probity. To some extent, it's probably happened by accident as much as deliberate design, being part of a fixed exchange rate system and the particular economic circumstances surrounding the other countries within that system have probably been one of the factors which has led to the surpluses in Germany, but no, it's a good model.
Well, may I ask you, let's follow this route for a second. Thatcherism, as you mentioned before, was strongly associated with the Institute of Economic Affairs. And, for many people today, Thatcherism is actually more than what it was historically. So Thatcher is associated with full-fledged privatization. To an extent, it was unmatched by historical reality, of course. I mean, she changed a lot. She had a great impact in the history of Britain, but she didn't privatize government, let's put it this way. Still, her ideas have been associated with the Conservative Party for quite some time. Are they still? What's your view of Boris Johnson's tenure so far? I mean, how is, with David Cameron tried to refashion, conservative economic policy under the label of compassionate conservatism or his version of it. But how is England in terms of, friendliness, so to say, towards the kind of viewpoints that were popular, at least within Thatcherite circles a while ago?
Well, first of all, we should just explain some of the limits to what Thatcher did. So Thatcher removed government controls on prices and incomes. She removed government controls on individuals and investors exchanging money and investing abroad. She privatized quite a large number of industries, although the more controversial privatizations probably took place under the Major government and to some extent under Blair. Government spending didn't reduce all that much as a percentage of national income. And she also reduced marginal top tax rates, which were up to 98% at that time. None of those things would anybody really want to reverse. Not even the Labour Party in its wildest moments would want to reimpose exchange controls, prices and incomes policies, and 98% income tax rates. But then if you look at the other side of the ledger, it was a period when regulation of business in many respects actually increased quite dramatically, especially in the financial sector. It's a period when the reforms to schooling and education probably centralized control more than decentralized it, and there was really no meaningful reform of the National Health Service whatsoever. So what she achieved was really important, because Britain, you could argue, was on the edge of a precipice on the way to becoming like South American countries were at that time. So I don't want to understate what she achieved, but really most of what she achieved is pretty uncontroversial now. And the debate within the Conservative Party, and there certainly is a debate within the Conservative Party, certainly exists between those really who want to roll out the Thatcher agenda further, to have more choice and competition in education, more choice and competition in healthcare, low government spending, and so on, and those who essentially want to be conservative in the conservative, traditional conservative spirit of really not changing very much unless you absolutely have to. And Boris Johnson, I think, falls to a large degree into that category. And both Theresa May, Boris Johnson's predecessor, and Boris Johnson have taken actions even before the COVID crisis, which significantly increased government spending. And according to our Office for Budget Responsibility, forecasts will contribute significantly to a rise in the debt trajectory of the UK government over the next few decades. So there isn't the same appetite in the current Conservative Party to control public spending. We spent 5 years trying to control public spending in the UK from 2010 to 2015. We call that austerity. That austerity involved government spending reducing by 0.5% per annum in real terms over 5 years, so about 2.5% in total. And it caused a huge political backlash. And I think the Conservative Party have just run scared of the idea of controlling government spending, given the experience from 2010 to 2015.
Well, absolutely. I think it's a very good point. And what perhaps somebody may emphasize, that contributing so much to the growth of public debt is also against a conservative position. I mean, even a quieter, not reformist conservative should be mindful of long-term effects on public finance.
Well, one of the points I often make is, why is public debt a conservative position? Why is it that socialists are often concerned about the intergenerational effects, say, of climate change, but they want to spend money now and impose the costs on future generations? If you're a socialist, why do you have a particular preoccupation of ripping off future generations in order to benefit the current generation? I don't see a coherent socialist philosophy that ought to be in favor of government indebtedness. Perhaps we ought to make that point more often.
Absolutely. I have a couple of questions, and then I'll set you free. All in all, this letter was, I think you made a point that was very interesting. very difficult to organize, because bringing together 360 people without emails, well, very likely also before fax was of widespread use. So it was done by by old-fashioned letters and perhaps by the phone. It was, in a sense, a genuine political accomplishment. I mean, getting so many people around a political statement wasn't easy. But really the effect wasn't much. Perhaps Mrs. Thatcher actually was somehow reinvigorated in her conviction that it was important to go against the grain.
Yes, she probably was. She was probably as pleased by this letter as she was when she was refused an honorary degree at the University of Oxford. She probably regarded it as a matter of pride. So yes, it probably did have the opposite effect from that which they would have wished.
If you're thinking of similar initiatives by economists, what comes to mind? Of course, there was a famous exchange of letters to the Times of London in the 1930s, with Lionel Robbins and Hayek on one side, and Keynes, and once again some Cambridge economists on the other side. I do remember, but vaguely, that there were competing letters on the Obama stimulus. With the Cato Institute, for example, bringing together a substantial number of economists, including a couple of Nobel laureates, in, so to say, advising to be cautious about the extent and the potential effect of the Obama stimulus. What else? And more broadly speaking, do you think this is an effective way of communicating economic ideas, or really not?
Well, I think that it has now become so easy to do this type of thing that it happens quite regularly. It might get some media headlines for a short period of time. It possibly contributes to influencing the climate of opinion, but it's one amongst many things that do that. But and there are lots of letters like this happen all the time, and it's become so easy to do now. One interesting thing is that the number of people who sign these letters who have no expertise in the subject has dramatically increased. But these 364 were really serious people. I mentioned Mead, one of the Nobel Prize winners, who signed it. Angus Deaton signed it as well, a Nobel Prize winner, and there are probably others. And we're talking about it now, 40 years later. I think this is unique. I don't think we'll be talking about the Stagnaro letter in 40 years' time.
Well, I hope even in 40 days.
But the 364 Economist letter, it's momentous because there were so many, because it was so difficult to organize, because they were such big figures in academia, but also in public life. And because of the claims they made were so strong, the issues were very contentious. But then the icing on the cake, of course, is that people on the other side want to keep it alive because of the claims that they made being so rapidly being demonstrated, not just to be misguided, but to be actually wrong because they overclaimed. Indeed, they made objective statements about matters in economic policy, which are clearly subjective, and any economist ought to know that they are subjective matters. So I don't think there'll be another letter we'll be talking about in 40 years' time.
Well, I think one of the dangerous claims typical of these letters, even the lesser one, without getting into the 1981 one, is that they give people the impression that there is something like, the economist's view on political matters. Basically, I mean, the point, in a sense, is precisely an attempt to rule out of the number of respectable opinions, the opinion of some scholars that disagree with you. Of course, one of the relevant things with the 1981 letter is that clearly we were closer to the existence of a real consensus, of a 100% consensus in those years than we are today, I suppose.
Yes. So no, if in the United States at that time you would have had a real debate about these issues. In the United Kingdom, the economics profession, economics teaching, was a long way behind the United States, and it changed in the 1980s and 1990s. So yeah, there was a real consensus behind a set of ideas which I think were wrong. But what is most dangerous is that there was a real consensus behind a set of ideas which these people thought were actually indisputable, and that the alternative ideas were just not even worth discussing. The textbook that was used in universities at the time was actually a Canadian textbook by Richard Lipsey, or textbook by a Canadian author. And I remember the edition that I used in the first year of my economics course at Durham University in 1982, and it mentioned in a footnote, I think it was, David Laidler, who is a very esteemed economist from Manchester, who emigrated to Canada, about, I think it was Laidler not taking the view that there was a long-term trade-off between inflation and unemployment. And Lipsey went on to say that there's not space in this book, it's a 540-page book, to discuss such extreme views. No, so that was the state of the economics profession. You couldn't even get a proper footnote in a standard economics textbook, which brought in the idea that there might be no long-term trade-off between inflation and unemployment.
Let me finish with this. It's very interesting. Because in a sense, as you mentioned before, with all its shortcomings, the Thatcher government had an agenda, and that agenda was crafted, in a sense, not directly by the Institute of Economic Affairs, but it was crafted because some politicians were exposed to the ideas of the Institute of Economic Affairs, beginning with Kid Joseph and monetarism and Friedman and so on and so forth, and on a longer time horizon, so to say, because of Hayek's enduring influence in England. But most people changed their mind after, the policy succeeded, not before. So it was not that the policy change was brought by a change in the climate of idea. I mean, these ideas were, something that only a very small minority of scholars shared. But the policy success somehow made them more mainstream.
Yes, so that's true. But I think we probably have to distinguish between economists in academia who I think really were just behind the development of the subject, and economists who were working in other intellectual spheres who perhaps had a better understanding, including pretty talented people working in journalism at the time, Peter Jay and others, who were
Andrew Alexander, this kind of people.
Yeah, absolutely. Sam Britton, who were able to articulate these ideas pretty effectively. But there were also ideas that the population of the United Kingdom basically understood. The idea of tax and incentives, keeping government spending and borrowing under control, what you had to do in order to keep inflation under control, and this type of thing. Intuitively, I think the British people got this, and that's why they supported Margaret Thatcher at the 1979 general election.
Let me really come to a close with a personal question. You recently became the director of the Vinson Centre at the University of Buckingham. Can you explain us what it's doing, what it's going to be doing, and what sort of initiatives coming out of Buckingham we should keep our eyes open for?
Okay, So the University of Buckingham was set up actually as a result of an initiative by the Institute of Economic Affairs in the late 1970s as an independent university in a system which was then very tightly state controlled. It's less tightly state controlled these days. And Nigel Vinson, who is a long-term supporter of the Institute of Economic Affairs, decided that he wanted to develop a base within the University of Buckingham, which would work closely with the IEA to try to develop both research and outreach and engagement to promote a classical liberal understanding of economics. So this will include what I sometimes jokingly describe as a sort of cradle to grave program of economic outreach programs, where economic outreach events where cradle is kind of about 16 and grave is about 35. I'm sure many academics go out on longer than that, but the idea is to have events, seminars, lectures, conferences and so on, which promote a better, more considered understanding of classical liberal economics, firstly amongst people who are learning economics for the first time in sixth forms, and then the group of people will gradually become smaller as we focus on those who are most interested in classical liberal ideas. So that's one set of activities that we will have. A second set of activities of research and public engagement programs in the area, one which we've developed so far is in the area of free trade and in Africa. So Alexander Hammond is leading a project there to promote a better understanding of the new African free trade zone, which is being created, and to try to work with partners in Africa to bring about concrete trade policy reforms in African countries. The third thing I want to do is to develop a truly academic program which uses the resources of the Vinson Centre. We have a fantastic history of economic thought library, and to work closely with a relatively small number of people who want to do what is called in the UK, I don't know whether you have a similar thing in Italy, called a professional doctorate, where people who are working in an area of practice, they could be working as a researcher for a member of parliament, or as a journalist, or working in a think tank, or something like that, do a program of study which leads to a doctoral qualification, but it has a strong practical element to it. And I think the Vinson Centre is an ideal place to have a professional doctorate in public policy to support people who want to do further study in that area, but who are working in practice and don't wish to do a PhD.
Well, this is a fantastic program. So, well, good luck with all of it. And thank you so much for your time and for having this chat today.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.